The Galactic Council sat in their vast chamber, a room filled with floating orbs and ethereal beings from a dozen star systems, their eyes fixed on the holographic display of Earth, a young world struggling to survive amidst the wreckage of its own conflicts. They had watched humanity for centuries, and while they had once considered their potential, they had long since decided that humans were a passing phase, a brief spark in the great history of the cosmos. So when they called the Earth leaders to the table to decide their future, it was not with hope, but with a sense of finality, a chance to cast them aside as nothing more than a nuisance. And to do so, they devised a plan to provide them with the weakest possible ship, one that would be unable to even leave the atmosphere of their own planet. It was an ancient craft built by an extinct race, long forgotten by all, but the oldest of the galactic powers. The ship had no advanced systems, no weapons, and barely enough propulsion to stay aloft, let alone travel across the stars. The Council believed the humans would either fail to repair the ship or crash it in an embarrassing show of their inability to adapt to the vastness of space. The message was clear: you are not worthy of this universe, you are weak, and this ship is the proof of that. The humans accepted the challenge, not knowing what awaited them. But they did not shy away from it. They boarded the ship with a quiet defiance, a group of the best and brightest from Earth assembled for what they thought would be a suicide mission. The captain of the crew was an experienced fighter pilot named Sarah Drayton, who had seen the worst of humanity's wars and come out alive every time. Her eyes were hard, but determined. She had the heart of a lion and the mind of a tactician. Beside her was Dr. Elias Hawke, a scientist who had spent decades studying theoretical physics and the possibility of faster-than-light travel. Though he had no answers, he had ideas. Big ones. The ship's engineer was Marcus Ruse, a young genius who could fix anything, no matter how broken, and beside him was Mia Lowell, a former soldier turned medic, whose calm under pressure made her the glue that held the team together. They were all aware of the odds stacked against them, but they were humans. They had faced worse and survived. They trusted each other with their lives, and they trusted in their ability to adapt when faced with the impossible. The ship's hull was rusted and covered in strange markings, the engines barely functional, the bridge a mess of outdated controls and flickering lights. Sarah took her seat in the pilot's chair and stared at the uninviting controls. She knew this would be no easy task. With a sigh, she turned to her crew. We either make this work or we die trying. There's no middle ground on this one. Elias grinned despite the ship's sorry state. He felt an excitement build inside him, the possibility that this ship might not be as weak as it seemed. Marcus adjusted a few wires and turned to Sarah. Ready when you are. Sarah nodded and pulled a lever, initiating the launch sequence. The engines sputtered and groaned, but they fired to life. With a roar that rattled the ship, the crew exchanged glances of disbelief. But then the ship lurched forward into the sky, and the countdown to their destiny began. The ship ascended with a jolt, as if reluctant to leave Earth's embrace, and yet the crew was alive with excitement. Every small tremor in the hull reminded them of how close they were to failure, but still they held their breath and pressed on. Sarah gripped the controls, her eyes focused on the fragile instruments in front of her. The ship groaned as it pushed through the upper atmosphere, the shaking growing more intense with every passing second. Dr. Hawke stood behind her, studying the data screens, his fingers moving rapidly across the flickering console. He could feel the ship straining, but he saw something in the readings, something odd. He called over to Marcus. This ship's energy signatures are off. It's like it's generating more power than it should be, considering the state it's in. Marcus raised an eyebrow from the engineering bay behind them. How much more power are we talking? Elias gave him a look on. No, engineer, but we're talking about 10 times more than what the ship's supposed to generate, and it's not overheating. This thing shouldn't even be able to hold together, but it's still holding steady. Marcus frowned. He was used to fixing things, not understanding the mysteries behind them. This ship wasn't just broken, it was doing the impossible. Mia entered the bridge from the medical bay, her footsteps light but purposeful. What's going on? She asked, her gaze flicking between the crew. Everyone still in one piece. But what about the ship's condition? We're about to find out, Sarah muttered under her breath. The ship was almost through the atmosphere, but its speed was increasing too quickly. She tapped a few controls, and the outside view shifted to show the curvature of Earth below them. The blue planet shrinking rapidly. They were already far beyond any human-made spacecraft's reach. But it didn't feel right. Something was wrong. The energy readings from Elias were only growing stranger by the second. As Sarah tried to adjust the trajectory, the ship suddenly lurched forward violently, tossing everyone in their seats. The ship's control systems malfunctioned with alarming speed. Panic briefly flickered in the crew's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by an adrenaline-fueled focus. Sarah yelled out as she fought to regain control of the ship. "I'm losing control. I can't keep it steady. We're too fast." Marcus rushed to the systems, but the controls were unresponsive. The ship's engines were running full throttle beyond what was ever intended. Suddenly, a flash of blinding light filled the cockpit as the fabric of space seemed to tear apart before their eyes. The crew gasped in shock as the ship plunged through a swirling vortex. They had no frame of reference, for it wasn't just a wormhole, it was something more alien. It was as if the very nature of reality had bent around them. The view screen flickered wildly as the stars outside twisted into impossible shapes. The stars were no longer distant dots. They were streaking lines passing by faster than the speed of light. The ship was caught in the slipstream of something far greater than any technology they had ever encountered. Sarah struggled to maintain consciousness as the pressure intensified. Her vision blurred and her hands shook, but the crew was not ready to give up. The ship twisted and turned through an unknown dimension, pulling them further from the familiar universe they once knew. Yet there was something exhilarating in the chaos, something undeniable about the power that surged through the ship. It was as if they had unlocked a door to a force beyond even the reach of the Galactic Council's most advanced technologies. With a final shudder, the ship snapped out of the vortex and into a strange new void. They had no idea where they were, but they could sense it. They weren't just out of Earth's orbit. They had left behind the galaxy itself. They were somewhere far beyond anything they had ever imagined, and the question was no longer how to survive this journey, but what to do with the power that now lay within their grasp. The ship came to an abrupt halt in the strange void, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The stars outside no longer held their familiar patterns. They were not distant pinpricks of light, but streaking, twisting lines, as if the universe itself had been stretched and warped. Sarah's hands shook on the controls, and for a moment, she simply stared at the chaos unfolding outside the viewports. They had passed through something beyond their understanding, a rift in the fabric of space-time itself. And now they were somewhere uncharted, somewhere no human had ever been. What the hell just happened? Maida's voice broke the tense quiet, her grip tight on her seat, as the ship continued to hum with unfamiliar energy. Elias rushed to one of the science consoles, his fingers flying over the controls. "This is impossible," he muttered, his brow furrowing. The readings were unlike anything he had ever seen. "We're not just in a different part of space. This isn't even the same dimension. None of the usual laws apply here. Gravity is fluctuating at random intervals. Time itself, it's not stable." Marcus, who had been working on the ship's systems, turned from the engineering console, his face pale. "I've never seen anything like this. It's like the ship's systems are trying to adapt to whatever this place is, but it doesn't make any sense. The energy readings are off the charts." Sarah took a deep breath, gripping the edge of her seat. "How bad is it?" "We're not falling apart yet," Marcus replied, but his tone held an edge of uncertainty. "But this place, it's unstable. We need to figure out where we are and how to get back. We're not equipped for whatever this is." Elias paused, looking up from his console, his eyes filled with a spark of something more than scientific curiosity, something dangerous. "What if we don't need to get back?" he asked, his voice low, contemplative. "What if we're standing at the edge of something we could use? If we can control this, whatever it is, we could change everything." Sarah shot him a sharp look. "Control this? Elias, we're talking about reality itself bending in front of us. We barely got out of that wormhole, and you want to play God." "It's not about playing God," Elias said, his voice steady. "It's about survival. This power, It's like nothing we've ever seen. It's not just a ship malfunction. This is something bigger than all of us." Sarah shook her head, trying to process his words. They had always prided themselves on human ingenuity, on their ability to adapt, but this was something else entirely. They were no longer dealing with a malfunctioning ship or even alien technology. They were navigating the very fabric of the universe. Before she could respond, the ship shuddered again, and the screens around them flickered violently. A loud crackle filled the air as the ship's core thrummed with energy. Suddenly, one of the viewports shifted, showing a swirling, glowing mass, an enormous, pulsating entity of light and energy, moving through the strange space. It seemed to be alive, its movements erratic, as though it was watching them. "Did anyone else see that?" Mia whispered, her voice tinged with awe and fear. "I saw it," Elias replied, his eyes wide with a mix of fascination and caution. "Whatever that is, it's not just a phenomenon. It's aware of us." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had been trained to face the unknown, but this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. They were no longer just in a strange place. They had caught the attention of something else, something far more powerful than anything they could comprehend. As the ship stabilized, a deep, resonant hum filled the hull, a signal that they had passed through some kind of threshold. The fabric of reality itself was responding to them, bending in ways that should have been impossible. Sarah knew they had no choice but to continue forward, to see where this path led, but she also knew one thing with certainty. The journey they had embarked on was far more than they ever bargained for. They weren't just exploring the unknown. They had stepped into the very heart of it. "Prepare for anything," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. "We're not in control anymore. Whatever happens next, we face it together." The crew nodded in silent agreement, knowing that their survival, and perhaps the fate of the entire universe, now depended on navigating this strange new reality they had stumbled into. And with every passing moment, they could feel the raw power of the ship's newfound abilities pulsing through them, promising more than just a way home. It promised something far more dangerous and infinitely more thrilling. The ship drifted deeper into this strange dimension, and for every second they lingered, the sense of wonder and dread grew stronger. The crew watched in silence as the stars outside continued to twist and warp, merging and splitting in ways that defied logic. Time itself seemed to lose meaning. In one moment, it felt like they had been drifting for hours, yet in the next, they saw the same stars they had passed moments before, only now they were behind them. Sarah clenched her fists on the control panel, trying to make sense of the chaos. "How do we even begin to navigate in this place?" she muttered to herself. The instruments were almost useless here. The readings fluctuated wildly, no longer giving any real sense of direction or distance. "Elias, any ideas?" Elias stood at the science console, his eyes darting over the constantly shifting data streams. He was clearly torn between fascination and the looming sense of danger. "I think this ship is tapping into something far beyond what we understand. These anomalies, they're not just random. They're purposeful, like the laws of this reality are in flux, waiting for something to reshape them." "Wait, you're saying it's responding to us?" Marcus asked, his voice edged with disbelief. He was at the engineering station, his eyes fixed on the diagnostic screens. "If this thing is conscious, we're going to be in real trouble. What if it decides it doesn't like us being here?" "That's one way to put it," Elias muttered, adjusting a few settings. "I don't think it's sentient, but it's certainly aware of our presence. Whatever we do here, we're interacting with forces we've never even begun to comprehend." Mia, standing near the medical bay, shifted nervously, her eyes scanning the eerie sights outside. "So what now? We just keep exploring this place." Her voice was a mixture of awe and uncertainty, and Sarah could feel the tension rising among them all. "We have to," Sarah said firmly, though even she wasn't sure. "We can't turn back now." If we don't figure this out, we might end up lost in this place forever. We need to understand the rules, and that starts with experimentation. Elias nodded, though he still looked uneasy. I think I know how we can push further, but we'll have to trust the ships. Unnatural stability for a little while longer. His voice trailed off as he turned back to the console, deep in thought. What if we could amplify the energy the ship's generating? The readings suggest that whatever this place is, it's highly reactive to energy, especially unstable energy. If we can trigger a larger shift, maybe we can get a better understanding of what we're dealing with. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You want us to supercharge this thing? Are you sure that's a good idea? I don't know, Elias said honestly, but it's the only way we're going to learn anything at all. We can't just sit here and wait for something worse to happen. Not when we have this kind of power at our fingertips. Fine, Sarah agreed, though unease gnawed at her gut. But we do it carefully. We don't know what will happen if we make the wrong move. Elias nodded and moved quickly, adjusting controls on the main console. There was a low hum as the ship seemed to respond to his commands, the energy levels building steadily. The ship's form began to pulse with the power it was harnessing, its strange, unfamiliar lights flickering in sync with the rising energy levels. Outside, the warping of space-time intensified. The stars seemed to stretch and bend, creating impossible geometries that defied all known physics. The ship was moving through it all as though it were part of the very fabric of this new reality, yet Sarah knew they were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Whatever they were manipulating, they were playing with the boundaries of the universe itself. Ready, Elias said, stepping back from the console, his voice sharp with anticipation. This could take us places, or it could rip us apart. Just do it, Sarah ordered, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on the shifting space beyond the ship. The moment Elias hit the final sequence, the ship's core flared to life, a blast of energy surging through it with terrifying force. The ship jerked forward, hurtling through the void with terrifying speed. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze as the very fabric of space and time folded around them. The stars stopped moving. The air became still. Then, without warning, the ship was flung forward, faster than anything human-made should have been able to travel. Sarah's stomach lurched, but she kept her focus. They had done it. They had made the first move in a game they couldn't yet understand. But what was waiting on the other side was far more than they could have imagined. The ship lurched forward, and the crew braced themselves, gripping their seats as the overwhelming force of their jump tore through the fabric of reality. The stars streaked by in surreal, dizzying patterns, flickering like broken lights in the dark. For a moment, it felt as though they had entered another universe entirely, one that defied all sense of comprehension. The very laws of nature seemed to stretch and distort, leaving them unsure of what was real and what was a trick of the mind. It was as if the ship itself had become a living thing, propelled by forces far beyond human understanding. And then, with a violent jolt, the ship snapped back into something resembling normality. The stars settled into place, no longer warping and bending, though the sense of disorientation lingered. The crew exhaled collectively, relief mingling with the tension that had built up throughout the chaotic jump. But Sarah knew better than to feel safe. She had seen what had happened in the wake of their first jump, and the silence that followed now felt like the calm before a storm. "Status," she demanded, her voice steady, though her mind raced to process the unknown. Elias quickly checked the instruments. We've arrived somewhere new, but it's not like last time. This is different. It feels static, like we're caught in a stasis field. The energy readings are off the charts again, but they're stable. It's almost as if time itself is being controlled here. Marcus was already on the engineering consoles, fiddling with various switches and displays, but even he couldn't hide his concern. This ship's holding together, but just barely. If we push it any further, we might lose everything in one catastrophic failure. Then we stop, Sarah said, though her mind raced with 1,000 questions. We need to figure out where we are first. No more experiments, not yet. Just as she finished speaking, the ship shuddered again. This time, it wasn't from the usual vibrations of their hyperspace jumps. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the walls of the ship seemed to vibrate in a strange harmony, as though the entire structure was resonating with the unknown energy surrounding them. Mia, who had been standing quietly at the back, suddenly stiffened. Something's coming. I can feel it. Sarah turned sharply to look at her. What do you mean? Mia's eyes were wide, and her voice was tinged with fear. I don't know. It's like a presence. Something, or someone, is out there, watching us. Before Sarah could respond, the ship's viewports flared with a sudden surge of light. A vast shadow passed over them, blocking out the stars. A massive form loomed in the distance, something so enormous it seemed to swallow the surrounding space. It was a structure, but not like any the crew had ever seen. It was a twisting, organic thing, built from materials that shimmered and pulsed with strange energy. Is that a ship? Elias whispered in awe. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. The sheer scale of the thing left her speechless. Its form was not a typical vessel. No sleek metal. No sharp lines of a technological masterpiece. Instead, it looked like something that had grown from the void itself. Something that could not be made but only become. Its surface shifted with a fluidity that defied explanation, like it was a living entity, breathing, alive in some unexplainable way. It's massive, Marcus murmured. It's unlike anything we've ever encountered. No known species could build something like that. It's not just a ship, it's a presence. Suddenly, the ship's sensors lit up with alarms, signaling the presence of hostile entities. The crew froze, as the reality of their situation hit them. They weren't alone anymore, and whatever this thing was, this massive presence that loomed before them, they had just crossed into its domain. The crew had made a mistake, and the consequences of that mistake were now staring them down. It's scanning us, Elias muttered, his voice tinged with dread. It knows we're here. Can we outrun it? Sarah asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Marcus shook his head grimly. We're barely in control of this ship as it is. If that thing decides to engage us, we're screwed. The massive entity, this gargantuan ship or structure or being, shifted again, sending a pulse of energy directly toward them. The entire ship rocked with the force of it, and the crew scrambled to hold on as the vessel seemed to be pulled toward the presence. We need to move now, Sarah shouted, urgency in her voice as she slammed her hand onto the control panel. Elias, stabilize the drive. Elias worked feverishly, his fingers flying over the controls. I can't. The ship's energy is responding to this thing. It's like it's feeding off us. If we don't find a way to break free, it's going to consume us. Then let's give it a fight it won't forget, Sarah said through gritted teeth, adrenaline surging through her. She knew they had no choice but to face the unknown head-on. The power they had harnessed might be their only weapon against this cosmic entity. But no matter how much they pushed, it was clear they were no longer the hunters. They had become prey. The pulse of energy from the massive entity shook the ship again, and Sarah's grip tightened on the controls. Every system in the vessel screamed for attention, warning lights flashing across the console as the ship's energy reserves began to drop. The presence outside them was closing in, and it felt like the very air inside the ship was being drawn toward it, sucked into the overwhelming power that seemed to radiate from the being. Can we fight it? Marcus asked, his voice filled with disbelief. We're dealing with something beyond anything we've ever imagined. How do we even begin to fight back? Sarah's mind raced. They were running out of time. The ship's engines were already struggling to maintain the fragile balance of power, and the alien ship, if it even was a ship, wasn't waiting for them to come up with a plan. It was preparing to strike, its energy readings spiking once more. Hold on, Sarah shouted as she yanked the controls back, trying to steer the ship away from the growing force that was pulling them toward the massive entity. The ship groaned in protest as its systems struggled to respond, its engines sputtering under the strain. She could feel the heat building inside the hull, the power threatening to burst the ship apart. But if they didn't break free soon, they'd be at the mercy of whatever this presence was. "We need more power," Elias called out. His voice was strained, fingers flying over the data screens as he analyzed the ship's systems. "This thing is feeding off the energy we've been channeling. It's using it to anchor us here, to control us. Then cut the power," Sarah ordered. "Turn everything off if you have to, but get us free from its grip." "Understood," Elias replied, his voice urgent. He turned back to his console and began disconnecting the energy nodes from the ship's core, trying to sever the connection between the ship and the entity outside. But as he worked, he could see it wasn't enough. The ship wasn't responding fast enough, and the energy in the area was growing more unstable by the second. "Look at the viewport," Mia suddenly shouted, her eyes wide as she stared through the window. Sarah turned her head just in time to see a shadow moving toward them, a massive, swirling mass of tendrils, shifting and changing as if the very space between them was warping. The alien presence was no longer just a distant object. It was here, right on top of them, reaching out like something hungry. "It's alive," Elias whispered in awe and terror. The tendrils were not made of any known material. They shifted and morphed in ways that defied the laws of physics, twisting through space in impossible angles. They were composed of pure, fluctuating energy that seemed to respond to the ship's own power fluctuations. The more they struggled to break free, the more the entity grew in strength, pulling them back with an iron grip. "It's feeding off our energy," Elias muttered in realization. "That's how it's staying here, and it's drawing us in. It wants us to give it everything we've got." Sarah didn't have time to process his words. "How do we stop it?" she asked, her voice low and tight with desperation. The ship was beginning to feel more like a cage, the walls closing in as the entity's influence spread. Their energy was being drained at an alarming rate, and the systems were beginning to fail one by one. They needed to escape, but the more they resisted, the stronger it became. There was a brief silence, the crew exchanging uncertain glances as the reality of their situation settled in. Then Elias turned back to the console, his face set with grim determination. "We can't escape it, not unless we turn the ship's energy against it." Sarah's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" Elias took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with tension. "This ship, it's not just a vessel. It's a conduit. If we redirect the energy back at the entity, if we overload the core, we might just push it back long enough to break free." Marcus looked at Elias like he'd lost his mind. "Are you serious? That's suicide." "It's our only shot," Elias said, his eyes locking onto Sarah's. "We don't have time for anything else. We either fight back or we become part of whatever that thing is." Sarah hesitated for only a second, her mind racing through the possibilities. She didn't want to risk everything, but they were already on the brink of being consumed. This was their last chance. "Do it," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Do whatever you need to do, but we're going to fight. We're not going down without a fight." Elias nodded sharply, his fingers flying over the control panel as he set the ship's systems to overload. The ship's core began to hum louder, building energy at an exponential rate. The entire vessel shuddered under the strain, as though it could no longer contain the immense power that was being drawn into its systems. "Get ready," Elias warned. "Once I trigger this, we won't have much time before we lose control entirely." The crew braced themselves, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was certain: they were no longer just passengers on this ship. They were fighting for their survival, and it was time to make their stand. The ship's core thrummed with power, the hum growing louder and louder as Elias worked to stabilize the energy. Sarah's hands were tight on the controls, sweat beading on her forehead as she stared at the viewport. The massive entity was still looming outside, its tendrils inching closer, feeding off the ship's energy with an unrelenting hunger. They had no time to waste. Elias's fingers danced across the console, the sweat on his brow glistening under the intense lights. "We're almost there. Just a little more," he muttered, as sparks flew from the overloaded systems. The ship was groaning, every inch of it straining under the weight of the unstable energy they were channeling. "Come on, Elias," Sarah urged, her voice sharp, her knuckles white from gripping the controls. "We can't hold this much longer." I know," Elias snapped, his focus unbreakable. "The core's unstable, but we can't stop now. The entity is almost close enough to physically touch us. We overload it, and we push it back, or we all die right here." The ship jerked again, the vibrations intensifying as the entity's tendrils made contact with the hull. Sarah gritted her teeth as she felt the pulse of its energy seep through the walls, making everything inside the ship feel as though it was vibrating in sync with the being outside. "We're losing power," Marcus shouted from the engineering station. "The systems can't handle this. If Elias pushes this much further, we'll blow the entire core." Sarah turned to him, her face tight with determination. "We either make this work, or we're dead anyway. We don't have a choice." With one final, desperate motion, Elias slammed his hand down onto the last control. The ship's core erupted with an explosion of energy, sending a shockwave through the vessel. The lights flickered, the ship groaned, and the sound of metal twisting filled the air as the power surged through the hull. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, like a thunderclap, the ship shot forward, the space around them warping with an almost violent force. The entity's massive tendrils recoiled, as if struck by an unseen force, their slow, deliberate movements turning into a chaotic flurry. The hum of the ship's engines intensified, the energy feedback from the core radiating outward in a blinding surge. The ship lurched again, and Sarah was thrown back into her seat as the force of their sudden acceleration pressed them all down. The viewport exploded with light as the very fabric of reality seemed to rip open. Stars exploded in kaleidoscopic patterns, shifting and swirling, folding into themselves. The ship shot forward at impossible speeds, almost as if they were breaking through the boundaries of time and space itself. Outside, the entity screamed, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the very air of the ship. Its massive tendrils recoiled, its form shaking as the energy from the ship hit it directly. The ship itself had become a weapon, the core's overload acting as a counterforce to the entity's feeding. The entity, seemingly stunned, retreated in slow motion, its form flickering and distorting as it began to lose its grip on the ship. "It's working," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's pushing it back." But even as the entity recoiled, Sarah could feel the pull of its power, like an invisible hand tugging at the ship, trying to drag them back into its grasp. She clenched her teeth and fought the controls, struggling to keep them on course. The ship was still surging forward, but the energy levels were rapidly draining. She could hear the alarms blaring in the background, the systems struggling to maintain any semblance of order. "Can we break free?" Marcus shouted, his hands flying over the engineering panel. "If this keeps up, we'll burn out the entire core." "I'm not letting go," Sarah shouted back, her voice hoarse. "We're pushing through this. Hold on." The ship's speed continued to increase, and for a moment, Sarah could barely process what was happening. The walls of the ship were shaking, and everything outside looked like it was collapsing inward on itself. Time and space were becoming an incoherent blur. They weren't just moving. They were disintegrating reality itself with the force of the ship's overloaded energy. "Hold on," Elias yelled as the ship veered sharply. The stars outside twisted, and the space around them was pulled into a collapsing vortex. And then, with a final violent snap, the ship broke free from the entity's grip. The ship shot through the vortex, spiraling into a new reality. The world outside was nothing but a blur of impossibility, a vast, empty void, like the universe itself had been reset. Inside, everything went still. The hum of the ship faded, and the alarms finally went silent. For a moment, the crew was suspended in time, unsure of what had just happened. Sarah slowly unclenched her fists from the control panel, her heart still racing in her chest. Did we make it? Elias looked around, his face pale, but he nodded slowly. I think we've broken through. We're not in the same place anymore. We're somewhere else. But somewhere else was all they could grasp, because where they were now, they had no way of knowing. The boundaries of the universe had been shattered, and whatever came next would be far beyond their comprehension. They had survived, but at what cost? The ship drifted silently through the new void, the eerie calm after the chaos almost unbearable. The vibrations from the core had subsided, and the ship, though battered and on the brink of collapse, had stabilized, at least for the moment. Outside the viewports, there was nothing but emptiness. No stars. No nebulae. No sign of the twisted space they had just escaped. It was a black expanse, almost as if the universe itself had ceased to exist beyond the ship's hull. Sarah sat in her seat, breathing heavily, trying to collect her thoughts. Her hands were still trembling from the intensity of their escape. Her mind kept replaying the moments when they had been at the mercy of the entity, when it had felt like they were seconds away from being consumed. "We're alive," Elias said, almost in disbelief. His voice was soft, but the weight of what they had done hung heavily in his words. "Somehow, we're alive." "Barely," Marcus muttered, looking over the damage reports on his screen. "The ship's barely holding together. If we even try to move forward at this point, we risk tearing apart the hull." Mia, who had been standing quietly by the observation window, turned to face the others. "So, what now?" Her voice was a whisper, heavy with the gravity of their situation. "We're not even sure where we are anymore. We don't have a course, we don't have any comms, and we're running on fumes. There's no way to tell if anyone can even find us in this place." Sarah looked at her crew, at the faces of people she'd spent years with, people who had faced unimaginable odds and survived. For a moment, she considered the bleakness of their situation. They had broken through the fabric of reality itself, escaped something far greater than they could ever understand. But now, they were adrift, in a place beyond the known universe, with no guarantee they would make it back. They had fought for their lives, but survival was no longer their only concern. "To wherever we are," Sarah said finally, her voice steady, "we're not going back. Not after this. We've crossed into something new. We've survived an anomaly that could have ended us in 100 different ways. And now we have the chance to understand it, to make it ours." Elias's eyes lit up with that familiar spark of curiosity, the same spark that had driven him to push boundaries, to explore the unknown. "You're right," he said, leaning forward. "If we can tap into whatever this is, whatever we just crossed into, we could be the first species in history to truly understand the very essence of reality itself. We've broken through dimensions. We've reshaped space-time. This is beyond exploration. It's rewriting the laws of physics." Marcus shook his head, glancing at the blinking diagnostics on his console. "I'm not sure we should be talking about rewriting the laws of physics just yet. We don't even know what's out there, or what it wants. If we keep pushing things without understanding them, we could make things far worse." Sarah turned her gaze back to the viewport, her eyes tracing the endless expanse of the void. "I'm not suggesting we dive in headfirst, but we can't just turn back and pretend we didn't cross the line. What we've encountered, what we've survived, it's beyond anything we've ever known. We have the potential to be more than we were before." A long silence settled over the crew. The weight of their survival, of their journey to the very edge of existence, pressed down on them. They had witnessed the unimaginable, and now they had a choice: Retreat into the safety of the familiar or step forward into the terrifying unknown with the hope that they could control it. "We're here for a reason," Sarah said at last, her voice resolute. "And we're not going to waste this. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. If we can survive this, we can survive anything." Elias nodded, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Then let's figure out how to survive this. We've unlocked something new, something we can't even fully comprehend yet, but we will, together." As the crew gathered around the central command table, their faces set with determination, Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. They had faced the unimaginable, fought against the laws of nature itself, and emerged on the other side. They had shattered the limits of reality. Now it was time to explore what lay beyond. The universe had been rewritten, and with it, the future of humanity. The crew of the ship knew their journey had only just begun, and no matter where it took them, they would not stop.